Welcome. First of all, welcome. This is Unsolicited Perspectives. I'm Bruce Anthony, your host here to lead the conversation on important events and topics that are shaping today's society. Join the conversation and follow us wherever you get your audio podcast. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch our video podcast. Rate, review, like, comment, share. Share with your friends, share with your family, hell, even share with your enemies. On today's episode, I'll be interviewing Dr. Steph. She's a professor, an author. More importantly, she's done work and research about children that are unaccompanied minors migrating here to the United States. This is an important issue, and I'm looking forward to this interview. So that's enough of this intro. Let's get to the show. As I said at the top, I'm here with Dr. Stephanie Canizales, professor at the University of California, Berkeley, a faculty director of Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Innovation, say that 5 times fast, and author of Sin Padres Ni Papeles. Did I say that right, Dr. Steph?
Perfect.
Okay, because ladies and gentlemen, y'all know I have a speech impediment. I stutter. It's bad. I was trying to get all that in, but I did. But I want to welcome Dr. Steph to the show. We're going to be talking about some really important issues, and I'm excited about it. So thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I start every conversation with my guests with the same thing. Let's start at the beginning. You grew up in Los Angeles, and you're the daughter of Salvadorian immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And your parents were not only immigrants, but they were unaccompanied youth on their trip to this country.
Mm-hmm.
How did your upbringing and your parents' experience shape the person that you are today?
Yeah, that is like the single most important question, I think, to the trajectory of my career. I grew up knowing I was the daughter of Salvadoran immigrants, and that was pretty much it. For people that know the history of Salvadoran migration or Central American migration broadly, I would say it is a history sort of cloaked in silence because of the reasons of people's migration and also sort of the U.S. response to the arrival of Central Americans in the U.S. So there are histories of civil wars and repression. And my dad talks about growing up seeing people just get shot like in front of him and how that sort of desensitized his childhood, right? And it is something we continue to see in Central America today. But both of my parents were very much those silent first generation immigrants. We didn't really know. I'm the second of 4. We sort of came out in sets. So I'm the second of the first 2.
Mm-hmm.
My older sister and I didn't really hear a lot of migration stories. I think what we knew mostly is like what happened after my parents met and how our family came to be. So I didn't really know a lot about my parents' background. And I think that's what, especially being in LA, when I was at UCLA and I started to learn about Latino migration, Latino history, Latinos in Los Angeles, right? It sort of like piqued my interest of, okay, well, why do we keep hearing about Mexicans or the Chicano movement or Mexican Americans, and where do Central Americans fit in there? I took one Central American in the US class at UCLA, the first time the class was ever offered there. And it was sort of my little pocket of the migration world.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of set me on a trajectory of research on Central American youth, which was, I was interested in like myself, like I wanted to know, how did my parents' history shape who I am, what I do? So I sort of set along this research journey, and what ended up happening along the way is that I learned that my parents grew up unaccompanied in Los Angeles. I started to do my work on undocumented youth. I came to learn about unaccompanied youth in, sort of along the way. And as I went home I was living in Koreatown, went home to Orange County where my parents were living at the time. And I would tell them, you wouldn't believe these stories I'm hearing. You wouldn't believe, kids are growing up by themselves. This kid from Guatemala, this kid from El Salvador. And it was in 2014 that my dad sort of was like, well, yeah, that's kind of like, why are you surprised? That what you know how parents are, right? Like, you
Yeah.
didn't really discover this thing. Like, we've been doing it, you know?
Right.
So that was very much my dad. And at the time in 2014, folks might remember that was the unaccompanied child migrant crisis at the border. It
Hmm.
was the year of the humanitarian crisis. So the term unaccompanied became sort of mainstream that year. And that's kind of what started to shape the conversations I was having with my parents. What do you mean? My dad was a garment factory worker at 17. He was a carpet installer at 17. He went to New York and back because he couldn't find work in LA for a while. My mom, I finally asked her, like, what about you? And as I talk about in my book, women experience a lot of interpersonal violence, gendered violence, sexual violence. So this conversation with my mom, I've only had one. It was very tear filled. And I learned that a lot of what I was uncovering about young girls in LA in 2015, 2016 was very much the experience of my mom. Um, so it didn't necessarily, their experience didn't inform my interest in the topic, but it did feel full circle when I realized, oh, I am uncovering the story of my family by studying unaccompanied children from Central America or Latin America to Los Angeles.
And I have so many questions from that.
Yeah.
For our audience, let's give them a clear definition of what a unaccompanied minor or child actually is in the migration process. So, can you give
Yeah.
us a clear kind of like this is the scenario?
Yes. An unaccompanied child, according to the federal government definition, is a child who, at the point of apprehension, at a border or port of entry, they are unaccompanied by a parent or an adult caregiver, and they do not have lawful immigration status.
Mm,
So that is the federal definition. The way I define unaccompanied children is someone who migrates without an adult caregiver or a parent, and who also remains without a caregiver or a parent in the US context,
mm.
right? So when you're reading my work, none of the people that I interview or work with were apprehended at the border, but that does not preclude them from the unaccompanied child experience, right? In fact, it's heightened in that there was no system of care around them, right?
That we're going to get into the weeds here. So I'm going to reserve some of my questions for later because I'm going to
Yeah.
detour a little bit. But it's interesting that, and also not that your parents wouldn't share the stories of that journey with their children because oftentimes parents try to protect their children from bad things. Were there ever any moments growing up that flashed when you were studying and doing your research, that flashed, oh yeah, I remember my dad making this comment or my mom saying this when I was younger, that said, well, wait a minute, yeah, my parents did go through this. I'm remembering little stuff that they said or did that
Yeah.
showed. Yeah, okay, so do you have any examples?
Yes. My dad talks a lot about his first jobs in the US. I
Hmm.
didn't know they were when he was 17 years old and that he was
Hmm.
sending money to his mom. I knew that
Hmm.
he worked, as I mentioned, installing carpets, and that the person he worked for was a older Salvadoran man who refused to pay him for
Hmm.
9, 10 months, right? I remember my dad saying that he was the first in his family to migrate, and then his four younger siblings sort of followed. Um, and that each one sort of relied on him to sort of set the pace of what was going to happen for them in Los Angeles. I remember my mom talking a lot about, loneliness as a child
Hmm.
and talking about how my grandma, her mom wasn't around, and riding the bus to school alone and having to figure out how to get to the, junior high or middle school where she was assigned. It wasn't in Pico Union, it was like across town, right? She was getting bused there. So things like that where, I mean, in hindsight, like, duh,
Mhm.
you're a child laborer. You are an unaccompanied child. Um, my mom also talked a lot about living with different people.
Mhm.
And in the book, I do talk about young people who have long settled relatives, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're protected, right? It doesn't
Yes.
necessarily mean that you're cared for. So in that the one conversation I had with my mom about being unaccompanied, she did tell me, it was really uncomfortable to say like, I need undergarments, right? Or hey,
Mhm.
my body's changing. I might need to go to the store, things like that. Um, that now I realize, oh yeah, those are features of being an unaccompanied child.
Okay. There's more questions that I have, but I feel like the questions that I have are going to be specifically related to your book, and we don't want
Yeah,
to get too personal talking about your mother and your father. So
right.
let's get personal talking about you, specifically your academic and personal journey. Can you tell me about your career milestones? Obviously, you're a professor at Berkeley, ladies and gentlemen, Berkeley. So,
I know,
what
I
are
have
some of
to
the
tell
key?
myself that in the mirror sometimes. I'm like,
I mean,
"Girl,
Berkeley,
Berkeley."
Berkeley. What are some of the key milestones and challenges that you had along the way?
Yeah, um, so I cannot say, like, what my big milestones are. I think of my milestones, my successes, as very much, like, serendipitous. I was at the right place at the right time. I started studying unaccompanied kids in 2012.
Mhm,
Um Someone just told I wanted to study undocumented Central American youth organizing in LA, and someone told me there's a group of kids that meets at the Starbucks at this intersection in Pico Union on Friday nights. Pull up, right? Like,
okay.
and and I did, and it turns out they were all unaccompanied youth garment workers in downtown LA. And I was like, wait a minute, what do you mean you were 12 years old in a garment factory? Sending money to your mom in Honduras or Guatemala. Um, so I was in the field doing the work by the time the crisis of 2014 hit. I was
Mm,
one of the very few people as a graduate student that had at that point 2 years of original data on I study incorporation or integration of this population. So, when it came time to write the op-eds and give the opinions and do all the things, I was ready to do that, and I don't think that's very common for a graduate student at my career stage. So that sort of serendipitous placement put me on the sort of fast track. So when I think about how I got to Berkeley, I'm like, I couldn't tell you. Like it's all been a blur, and I remember my advisor telling me just like keep your head down and do good work. Just do good work. Um
mhm,
so I do feel like it's been a rocket ship, and I don't know when I got on it, right?
mhm,
Specifically. When I think about challenges though, I'm a middle child. Um, I am the person that is like, I'm going to leave a mark and you're all gonna know I was here, right? That is sort
okay,
of my personality. So when I got to grad school and there weren't very many Latina graduate students, in sociology at the University of Southern California, USC, where I got my PhD. And there was sort of a history of um, discrimination, to put it lightly, like marginalization,
mhm,
sort of discouragement
mhm.
of Latina students. And I remember my first year, go ahead.
You specifically said Latina
Mhm.
and not Latino. So, was it specific to Latin women, or gender didn't matter?
I think proportionately more women were in the Latino broad category, right? So there tended
Mhm,
to be more Latina women than Latino men admitted to our program.
okay,
I can't say that that was by design, but that kind of was how it was. were like 3 generations of Latino women ahead of me that when I came out with what I'm about to share, they were like, oh yeah, that same thing happened to me in that same class.
Mm-hmm.
It was my first year of graduate school, and I had taken 1 sociology class as an undergrad. So I was enrolled in now a full PhD sociology program, and I was
Right.
way in over my head. And a professor, I remember very explicitly, called me out in front of the class one day and said something about, if we were to describe Stephanie, we were talking about gender that week. If we were to describe Stephanie's demeanor, how would we describe it? Excuse me, Miss Ma'am, right? So she ends up describing me as unintelligent,
Whoa.
uninteresting, yes, not asking intellectual questions, and basically like incapable of occupying a serious role in that space.
This is your professor. Now,
Mhm.
personally, how much did it take for you internally to not take her outside and two-piece her? Because that would have been
I wish that
extremely
were my
difficult.
response. I wish anger had been my response, right? Like indignation, like, how dare you? But it was very much the narrative I came into grad school with, right? Like,
Mm,
it was never my plan. I fell into the thing that led me to the thing, and I was like, maybe she's right. I remember feeling humiliated. I remember going to the bathroom during our break. It was like a 3-hour class. We had a break at the 1.5-hour mark, and I cried and cried, and I came back and I sat through the rest of the class. And you better believe I never said a single word in another class unless
mm.
the professor, it was like an immigration class, or the professor was like openly supportive of first gen students. Um, so my middle child syndrome kicks in, like I'm
Mhm,
going to prove everybody wrong. I'm
mhm,
going to do this. So in terms of when I think about my career, I do think the challenges, right? Last March, I was at a conference presenting my research, and a woman came up to me after, a senior scholar in sociology came up to me and said, you can put Rolls-Royce rims on a Volkswagen and you're still just a Volkswagen. She told me after my quick little 15-minute presentation. So people say these things and I'm like, all right, let's go. Like,
you're right.
let's go, and I think about my advisor telling me, just do good work, focus, do good work. And I'm much more motivated by seeing justice and equity and kindness and empathy and inclusion of the people that I do my research with and that I'm deeply connected to, right? Like family
Mhm,
history ties. I'm much more motivated by, like, I am here for that. I am not here for whatever performative thing that we're doing. But if you want to bring out my middle child, like I will do that.
right.
We will go there, right?
How do you take the lessons that you obviously learn from the interactions from these professors and apply it to how you teach now?
Yeah. I assume baseline. And this is not because I assume deficit of my students, but I'm going to assume that we're all showing up in this space feeling inadequate, afraid, and underprepared. And
Mm,
and that, I think, motivates my kindness. And I remember being in um, undergraduate or graduate seminars, and the phrasing of a question sort of assumes that we all read that book, or we all sort
mhm,
of watch that documentary, or whatever it was, right? And I just assumed none of us did.
mhm.
So I'm going to start back here and walk us through it so we're all on the same page. And I try to close the gap so that a student doesn't feel um like they just listened to an hour-long lecture and they didn't know what the starting point was,
Right.
right? So I just kind of assume that we're all a little scared. And still, as a professor, I'm still a little scared. It's always that
Mhm.
one student that read the book I didn't read, right? And then they ask me, what about this? And I'm like, I'm going to go Google that and I'll be right back, right? So yeah, I don't think we can all ever really know the full
Hmm.
picture. And I try to just walk students through what I know and then fill the gaps from there.
So let's get to your book.
Yeah.
You write a book and it's specifically focusing on unaccompanied migrant youth.
Okay.
What are some of the most surprising and impactful stories that you uncover during your 6 years of research? And also, ethically, because you're dealing with a very vulnerable population, how did you approach that? Because there are going to be people that are going to be a little apprehensive about talking. So
Mhm.
how did you approach that ethically?
Yeah. So I'll say, to answer the first question, some of the most impactful or surprising components of the work, I would say, thinking back to that first moment when someone told me go to that Starbucks on the
Hmm.
corner, the whole thing threw me off, right?
Hmm.
I had come to the interest of studying undocumented Central American youth from the perspective of youth organizing. I was involved with the immigrant youth movement, with the sort of organizing around deferred action for childhood arrivals in 2011 and 2012. I was involved with this organization called Dream Team Los Angeles, named after the Dream Act, right? And the
Okay.
Dreamer movement.
Hmm.
So when I came to realize that there were unaccompanied youth garment workers, I was just like, I thought we were all in college, right? I thought we
Right.
were dreamers. I thought we were cap and gown wearing like a population. Um, so the whole concept was shocking. And at the time in 2012, the term unaccompanied wasn't in my vocabulary. I sort of came up with this term unparented, right?
Mm.
Because they had brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles living down the street, but what was missing was the parent.
Hmm.
Um, And that obviously, one of my dissertation advisors was like, "Well, don't they call their parents back home? They have parents. They're parented, but just not in the way," right? So I
Right.
was like, "Thank goodness unaccompanied is a thing now because that's actually what I mean." Um, so the whole concept was fascinating, impactful, and threw me for a loop. Um, One thing that I try to capture in the book is two potential pathways of coming of age because I talk about immigration in the way that sociologists of migration do as an incorporation question. How
Hmm.
do young people experience the arrival, settlement, adjustment, that whole process, right? Which we call incorporation. I try to map that onto the transition to adulthood. So these two passages happening at the same time. Um, what struck me in doing that work is that there is a material component to being unaccompanied, in that young people have to work to survive and they experience deep poverty and they're hungry and they can't buy the pair of denim pants that they want, even though they sew denim pants all day long in a factory,
Right.
right? There's that material component, but the transition to adulthood brought with it the emotional component,
Hmm.
right? My body's changing. I have my first crush. I don't have friends. The all of the angst of being a teenager coming into young adulthood, and then the emotional component of being the sort of satellite member of the family that remained behind. Yeah, that remained behind. Um, so all of these, I'm tracking these two passages and then I'm tracking two processes, right? The material dealings and then the emotional effect, and how those two things are interconnected. The poverty hurt their feelings, right?
Yeah.
The I work so hard and my family is still suffering hurts their
Mm.
feelings, right? There's this all this interconnectedness. Um, and the last two chapters, sort of data driven chapters of the book, are about young people who experience a positive adaptation, is chapter 4. and young people who experience what they call in Spanish perdición, which is translated to perdition, a deep
Hmm.
sense of loss. So I see that as like emotionally and materially positive adaptation, emotionally and material negative perdition. And that the differentiating factor between the two is meaningful social relationships.
I I have so many questions because they lose their childhood.
Sure.
They're an anchor. They're working. It's hard enough just as a full grown adult to
With legal
manage.
status,
Right,
speaking English,
right,
right?
right,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
manage in today's climate. Like, I swear,
Mhm.
no matter how much money I make, there's more bills. I don't know how I do it, right?
Where do
And
they come
so,
from?
the bills just the government. No, I'm just playing. So, uh, there's that aspect. There's the aspect of they're working illegally because children don't work in sweatshops in America, supposedly.
Supposedly
Um,
there are no sweatshops in America,
right,
right? Yeah,
supposedly, but
yeah,
you're telling me there are some in downtown Los Angeles. And since they're undocumented and the job is illegal, maybe they get their pay like, or maybe they don't, like your father. So, and they're responsible for also sending money back to their family. And there also must be some guilt associated with no matter
absolutely.
how bad things are here for me, my family is still suffering in a country that, as your father would say, people are just getting shot right in front of your face out in the
Right.
open. How does that I don't understand how the major what is the success rate? How many unaccompanied migrant youth get here and actually, like your parents, somehow make it, raise children that
Yeah.
go to college and
Become
do the
professors
next
that
step? Yes.
talk
Yes,
about this
like,
stuff. Right.
how many stories of that? Because I'm so interested in understanding the psychology of losing your childhood, having so much responsibility put on you as a young person, and then how
Mhm.
that affects you as you get older. Is there ever any time to just sit back and reflect when you do, like your parents, when you have accomplished so much, as to be like, "We made it," or is there
Right.
still a little bit of guilt of, "Yeah, but my family had to suffer a lot longer than I anticipated." I know that was a lot. I'm throwing a lot at you, but
Yeah,
these are the things that are running in my head right now.
I think it ties back to the second half of your original question, which was the ethical, like, what are
Right.
the ethical components of this, right? So part of being able to run this study for 6 years was that I made, a contractual agreement that I would not maintain the contact information or identifying information of the people that
Mhm.
I interviewed. So for me to be able to say, like, what happened, right? I ran this research from 2012 to 2018. Of course, through that time, I developed my own meaningful relationships with a set of young people, and we
Mm.
still are connected when I see them in Pico Union or downtown, or I'm invited to an event. I don't keep up with anyone on social. I like, there's no connection. You would never know who is a part of my research, but I can't do a follow up
Mm.
study, right?
Mhm.
Um, to really understand what is the success rate. And because, yeah, and because they were not apprehended at the border, there's no record of their arrival, where they went. It's all just in, and like, it's all here, right? And that's
Right.
what we know, like what's here. Um, So that's, yeah, that's, I couldn't really say what the success rate is, and that's actually something, and maybe we'll get into this later. My next project is like, what did
Mhm.
happen to all these kids since 2014? Where are they?
Right.
What are did they graduate school? Are they in like, what happened, right? The sort of long-term story. But in terms of the kids that I studied who were not apprehended and I sort of spent just everyday time with, I don't really know.
Mm.
Um, what I do know is that when I asked the last question of every interview, and I did 75 interviews, when I asked people, where do you see yourself? And I originally started with 10 years. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? And they would say, can't even think that far ahead.
Mm,
5 years, right? Like, so, okay, 5 years. What do you see yourself doing? Maybe I would have learned English. I would like to have seen my mom again, right?
mm,
That my siblings, last time I hugged my brother, I was 14 years old. Now I'm 27, right? Whatever it may be,
yeah.
right? And
Mhm,
and they would tell me in interviews, um, I promised them I would go back. They thought my research participants really thought that they would return home as teenagers still,
mm,
right? They come to the US, they realize you pay for literally, this is what they say, you pay for everything here: laundry, water, lights, bus, cell phone. You're taxed informally by your employer who says you need
mhm.
to pay taxes. Well, to who? To you, like,
Right.
so the money, like we were saying earlier, like the bills pile up, the money's just leaving faster than you can make it. So there's just all of these circumstances that young people aren't living the life in the US that they imagined they would. And they're not experiencing the success as we would define it, right? So the book actually ends with telling the story of like, well, how do they define success? And it is in part an emotional survival strategy to say, well, success can't be home ownership anymore. Guess what? Like success can't be college. Success has to be, I didn't have friends when I got here and now I do.
Mm.
My mom was hungry when I left and now she's not. Like the marker of success has to move so that they can cope with the everyday suffering and the pain of the experience of being unaccompanied and undocumented.
This is going to try to transition into my next question, but I'm curious. Um, it's important for my audience to know,
Mhm.
what are these unaccompanied minors,
Mhm.
children leaving? What is so bad there that even being here and basically having your wages garnished or not getting paid at all, and struggling to eat or maybe even find a place to sleep, what are they escaping that isn't so bad?
Yeah. Um, I talk in the book about extreme poverty
Hmm.
and everyday violence, like legal violence, and also illegal forms of violence against young people that cut their future short. So when we talk about young people losing out on their childhood, they were losing out on their childhood when they were 2, 3, 4 years old,
Yeah.
right? In the origin country, there was one young person that I interviewed who told me he started shining shoes in Guatemala City at the age of 3.
Mm.
Um, and that was his job, and his sister had another job, and the mom had another job. So it wasn't that he was following his mom around shining, that was his job. Um, so young people are leaving behind some of the highest rates of extreme poverty globally, but in sort of rural parts of Central America and Mexico today as well. That is the reality that young people have been working alongside their families or sometimes alone to overcome extreme poverty. And young people tell me in interviews that they remember their mothers crying that they didn't have, out of guilt, that they didn't have enough food to go around for the 4 or 5 siblings at the table.
Mm.
That there would be up one piece of meat and each sibling would take a bite of a piece of meat and that would hold them over for the week.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and in terms of the violence, we hear about it constantly, maybe not in the way it should be framed. Um,
Hmm.
Historically and with serious context, especially in terms of the US's role in creating the violence. But
Ladies and gentlemen, you hear
yeah,
what Dr. Steph said? She just backed up what I've been saying, that I said a couple of weeks ago, that Americans don't want to talk about our involvement in Central and South America in the 20th century, throughout the 20th century, how
absolutely.
we just destroyed governments and put people in place that maybe were corrupt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. And while telling Americans like it's for our safety, they're communists, right? Like the fear
Hmm.
of communist spread in the Western Hemisphere, and um, funding millions of dollars per day, governments that were repressing, persecuting. In Guatemala, full on genocide of indigenous communities that were organizing against their repression and the privatization of their land for U.S. corporate profit.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I tell my students what you need to know is that the US was funding militaries that were enacting scorched earth campaigns where they would light villages on fire from the outside in so people couldn't escape. And that freed up the land. And then they were, next thing you know, private markets, right?
Yeah.
Um, so the US has its hand in destabilizing the economy, the governments, um, and the social infrastructure of these countries. So kids are coming of age, and I really talk about it as kids are coming of age in societies where they can't imagine their futures. Sure, they're unauthorized, unaccompanied migrants. They're also just kids thinking about their futures, right?
Yeah.
So when they're facing extreme violence and poverty, and they've been working at the ages of 3, 4, 5, 6 in their origin countries, they come to the US, right? I talk in the book about one young person who was sewing tracksuits for Adidas at home in his living room in Guatemala. So when he comes to the US and he works at a garment factory, he's like, oh, I'm not doing it by hand. This is mobility, right? Like this is
Right.
skill, this is
Wow.
technology, this is advancement, because he remembers how tedious it was to sew the Adidas logo on these track jackets.
Wow.
Um, so it's things like that, right? I'm not working in the field. Now I'm a fruit packer. So that looks like improvement. But it's a job that any average American walking down the street would say, absolutely, I'm not taking that. Right.
Right. Okay. So, what findings from your research and all your work and your book do you think are critical for policymakers and the public to truly understand? We touched on a little bit here, but specifically for the policymakers and for people who watch certain news organizations or read certain news papers that paint one aspect of these unaccompanied children migrating here to the US that's important for everybody to know? I know that was a
Yeah.
loaded question. I'm giving you a lot of loaded questions today.
Yeah.
But
So my answers are a little long winded, but we're
let's
going to
go
go
for
for
it.
it.
That was
Yeah.
a long-winded question.
Um, yeah. What policymakers need to know, I think, Kamala's back on the scene, prominently back on the scene. And I remember in June of 2021, when Kamala, who as vice president, Kamala Harris, not just any Kamala, Kamala Harris was charged with the root causes of Central American migration, the root causes of migration.
Can you
That was
repeat that again for the people in the back that are
yeah,
swearing up and down that she is a border czar? What
y-
she was actually tasked with?
was getting at the root causes of migration. That was the agenda. It wasn't actually the border, right? So to her credit, it wasn't border policy, it was root causes. But June 2021, first trip to Guatemala. And what is the messaging? Literally says twice for anyone coming to the US, do not come. Do not come. That was the line. And I
Mhm.
remember, like, wow, you really missed the entire root causes,
Right.
by just telling people don't come. And I think for the for us to have a serious conversation about why unaccompanied children are ending up as low wage workers. It's all over the New York Times. It's all over Washington Post, Reuters, everyone's talking about unaccompanied child laborers. And they're talking about kids who were apprehended at the border, who are released to sponsor, like that whole thing. we want to get at the issue of unaccompanied child labor, we need to understand root causes, right? Like seriously understand them. And in the historical context that you and I were just talking about, right? 1950s on, there's a reason why the majority of children coming from Guatemala are indigenous. Let's talk about what the government in cahoots have been doing to indigenous communities that is destabilizing first adult men, then women, then families, and now lone child migrants. Let's talk about how these gangs came to be in El Salvador that are now targeting teenage boys. They were born in Los Angeles, California, and through deportation policy sent to El Salvador, and then they organized and proliferated throughout Central. Let's actually talk about the root causes, right? I think that is the most important thing. And then the other thing to take into account is that when we are developing policies or responses to the issues of unaccompanied child migration, we are coming at it from our perspective, Western society where childhood looks like this, and we expect families to be organized in these ways. And because of that, we do not hold space for the reality that kids are coming from societies where childhood means something different, where the role of a child is different, where children have been exposed to the suffering of family members that they now feel responsible for, and that they are actively engaged in care networks, right? They are carers as much as they are recipients of care, they give care to their families. So when kids come to the US and they're found in workplaces and they say, well, I'm working to support my siblings, my family, my grandma, whoever it may be, and then we deport the child, right? Or we punish the family, or we take a punitive, which we love to do here. It's like our cozy spot is just punishing people, right? We take this punitive approach to child labor without asking, why is this child working to begin with? And how can we meet that need? Right? Like, how do we respond in if they are carers, right? Like children are involved in networks of care. How do we reinforce the network of care so children can step back and live that ideal childhood that we say kids in the US live, right? Or we expect normative childhood to be. So I think that is the one thing I try to do in the work is forefront children's perspectives. You want to solve the crisis? Let's ask children why they do the things that they do instead of making assumptions and then punishing them for not doing the right thing, you know?
So it seems like what you're saying is money by itself is not going to fix the issue, because I know over the last 4 years, there's been an investment into the economies of Central and South America by the administration. But it seems like if the governments are already kind of corrupt, then that money doesn't necessarily go to improving the people that are living their lifestyle, and that we need to address more of a, instead of just an economical standpoint, more of the human and emotional factor that's involved. If I'm not getting that correctly, please correct me, but it kind of seems like money helps, but money isn't the savior, the absolute savior that it needs to be to help with this problem.
I think yes, you're right in that the foreign policy is let's provide jobs. But so the money is not invested in people. The
Right.
money is invested in corporations,
Mm.
you know?
Hmm.
So there's like energy plants and they're like European energy plants in Guatemala. And I think
Hmm.
it's like less than 10% of the energy that's produced by these plants is actually going to the communities and the rest is coming to the US. And right. So there's corporations that are moving in and those are being funded and their taxes are being lowered and protections are being put around them. And the premise is that maybe people will get jobs there. But what it does is actually put the profit in the pockets of the corporations. Right. So in which case the governments are not And I'm not saying these governments are not corrupt, but I would say they're working exactly as they're meant to be working, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are several social scientists who talk about, well, why doesn't the economic investment go to local communities, right? Why
Right.
there are organizations, there are community foundations on the ground working with people at a very localized level that are creating responses to like developing microeconomies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a better economic investment or a sort of long arm investment in that a lot of these schools are underfunded or there is no educational infrastructure in rural parts of Central America and Mexico. So why isn't money being put into that, right?
Okay. There's a certain tone that is used by news organizations when discussing these issues. How can we change that tone? The tone is typically, "No, this shouldn't be our problem." How do we change the tone so that every average day Americans who don't have a clue about what's going on as far as the immigration and migration issues, the true issues that are surrounding the immigration and migration, how do we reach those people to just be like, look, let's have some empathy here and talk about this as human beings as opposed to this isn't my problem?
Yeah. These are some big questions.
I'm throwing them at you, Dr. Steph. I'm throwing them at you.
Like, how do you solve all of the problems? so, so actually, I try at a sort of personalized level of my research expertise. I try to answer that question as it relates to incorporation, right? And what I've done in the book is okay, let me step back. Typically, when we talk about incorporation and policy on immigrants' rights and legalization and deservingness of inclusion in US society, sort of map onto this incorporation. The existing incorporation theory is that we measure is an individual or a group incorporated or not? That's the question we ask, right?
Okay.
And remember, I came to this through studying, like working with dreamers, right? Being involved in the dreamer movement, being involved in the deferred action for the DACA movement, deferred action for childhood arrivals. And those policies and programs are designed around the premise that there is a deserving, high achieving, undocumented young person that should be legally protected in the US, right? That's where the imagery of the cap and gown came from, right? Like these are American kids by every other marker except for their legal status. So let's meet them there. Incorporation theory mirrors that. We say there are markers of success. Those markers are socioeconomic attainment, educational attainment, occupational mobility, English language fluency, home ownership, business ownership, these markers, right? And you asked earlier, what is the success rate of these kids? By those markers, 0,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I
Mm-hmm.
try to redefine incorporation. Incorporation is a process by which people experience first orientation to a society. What are the features of the society that I'm embedded in? What are the practices? What are the beliefs? What is the way of dress? How do I get around this city? Right. And then adaptation to that society, adjustment, where they learn to navigate the structure of opportunities.
In that
I,
process, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I have to ask this question. If I'm wrong, please correct me. What you're describing kind of, it sounds like assimilation to fit in and make sure that you're seen but not seen. Don't you lose some of your cultural connection by making yourself more American? The stereotype of what American is, don't you lose some of your cultural ethnicity, who you are, how you were
Yeah,
raised?
absolutely.
Like, how do
Yes.
you combat that? Trying to weave in, I'm killing you with these questions. I know I am, but how do
No,
you
you know
combat
what?
that by trying to weave
You're
it?
reinforcing my book.
Yeah.
Part of the argument is that these young people are not becoming American. An incorporation process, again, is localized. They're adjusting to what's right here. There's no, I wouldn't even say I am incorporated into an American mainstream. I'm incorporated to my little pocket over here where I listen to reggaeton and I eat tacos every other day, like that. That's my version of incorporation into my society. So part of the argument of the book is that American society is stratified. This idea that we are all going to reach an endpoint of Americanness is false,
Mhm.
right? And your original question was, I can't even remember it, but I know.
Because I'm throwing so many at you.
but the point I was going to make is that the empathy question, how do we make other people care? What I try to do in the book is say, if the incorporation process is in fact orientation and adaptation, if the question is not, are you incorporated or not incorporated, but is it adaptation or perdition? There are US born individuals with less pigmentation than me, right? Who are experiencing perdition every single day,
Mm,
right?
mhm.
In the conclusion of the book, I ask these like a series of questions. Haven't we all felt disoriented in a social setting? And then we become oriented and then we adjust, right? Like I'm
Mm,
coming from UC Merced to UC Berkeley.
mhm.
I'm disoriented as hell.
Right.
I am going to go to my faculty orientation on the 22nd of August or whenever, and then eventually I'll adapt to that space. I would have then incorporated. There is a point at which we're all moving through society and experiencing orientations and adaptations. There are periods of our lives that we are experiencing deep perdición, loss, right? A loss of our future, a loss of our sense of self. So I try to say, if we stop sizing each other up socioeconomically, what is the value you bring,
Mhm.
right? Like, have you achieved the American dream that, like, low key, but also very high key? None of us are really. There's a very few
Yeah.
select people who are able to access those opportunities, right?
Right.
So if we're
Yeah.
real with ourselves, that American society is so stratified that most of us are on the borderline of not experiencing incorporation. Can we have empathy for these people?
Mhm. Yeah, you stuck that landing. You definitely, wow, that was a hell of an answer. That was a hell of an answer.
There you go.
So there's
And we're
another
done here. No.
there's another aspect of this migration um, subject, because migration often intersects with issues like race, gender, and
Yeah.
socioeconomic status. How do you address these issues in your research, and how critical are these issues to understanding this entire process?
Yeah. So that the stratification of US society by race, ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomic status, religion, sexuality, all of those things. Um, that is again sort of the starting point, sort of debunking this myth that there is an American society that we're all having an equal opportunity to incorporate into, right?
Mhm.
Um, what I spend more time focusing on, because I can only do so much in any given book, what I spend more time focusing on is how those features, those social locations, can sort of create pivot points for unaccompanied use. Um, I talk about unaccompanied as a status that we need to pay attention to, a stratifier, right? That if a kid has a parent or a caregiver or not, determines in the book I show whether a child experiences growing up as a student or a worker. right? So that's sort of the first little fragmentation. And I leave the 5 people that I interviewed that grew up in the US with an aunt, uncle, grandparent, whoever it was that took them in, supported them, they became a student, and they experienced life as a student. 70 other people remained unaccompanied. And from there, interrogate a little bit more, what is the role of indigenous ethnic identity? That indigenous young people are not accepted as Latin American by non-indigenous
Right.
Latinos, right? So they experience discrimination and verbal abuse, emotional abuse at work, at church, in community. They're getting off the bus and they're getting beaten up, right? Like things like that. Also gender, how gender stratifies access to or blocks or grants access to certain types of jobs, right? The fact that I was able to interview, I think it was like 60% of my interviewees were men because I was recruiting in public spaces where there were very many women that were just
Right.
hanging out at the coffee shop or at the donut shop, and I could approach. Even then, when I would ask, I'm running this project. Interviews are about an hour. I meet with people after work, and they would say, I don't leave the house. I go home. It gets dark. I go home. Right. So gender becomes this organizing feature. So it is then something that is really important to the question of, to what are young people becoming oriented and adapted to, and what resources do they have to engage in those processes, right? And then if the line between adaptation and perdition is social relationships, who has access to relationships? Right? And indigenous young people are very much engaged with one another because they are being discriminated against by non-indigenous Latinos. Women have relationships with other women, or when they're involved with men, it's in a romantic capacity, and those can become abusive, right? So there are
Right.
these sort of caveats, and I try to do that where I show what is a shared experience by virtue of being unaccompanied and undocumented. And then where do things start to pivot a little bit by gender and ethnic identity or language spoken, those sorts of things.
Wow. Okay. So you brought it up earlier, but let's get to it. What's next for you, Dr. Steph? What are some of the things that you're working on?
Yeah. Actually, playing off this last question, I'm have another book coming out next summer that I'm putting final touches on, that is just focused on the 36 of the 75 people that I interviewed that were indigenous, and trying to get at the question of, how does indigeneity sort of shape this entire experience? And what I find is that it slows the incorporation process and brings the body physical appearance into play because of darker complexion or shorter stature, various features that they associate with being indigenous. And then the really important role of language, because without language, you can't speak and you can't develop those, right? So indigenous young people arrive in the US, primarily speaking their Mayan languages, and they have to learn Spanish to then engage with non-indigenous, and then they have to learn English, right? So it's like a slower incorporation process that is very much based on, again, showing how relationships and ties matter. And then I mentioned also being really interested in what has happened with the kids that have been apprehended at the border and placed with adults and expected to show up in court and do all of those very formal US things. Where are they and what's going on? Yeah,
Right.
so that's the research I'm doing right now. Yeah.
That's dope. Is there anything that you would like to say to my audience before I let you go? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would really encourage folks, ever since last February, the New York Times released this expose about unaccompanied child workers. And that has really set the tone on the issue. And one of my critiques of the tone is that it is a bit ahistorical, the reporting, um, in that they characterize child labor, unaccompanied child labor, as a new economy. And
Hmm.
if the story of my dad from the 70s teaches us anything, is it's not all that new. And kids have been working since the construction of railroads, right? Like since
Hmm.
um, I don't know how far you want to take it, but I would encourage folks to really, if they're interested in the issue of unaccompanied child labor, to dig into the history of it. And I do that in my book. But there are also other ways to really get engaged, because if we want to solve the crisis of unaccompanied child migration and child labor, we have to understand where it started. So, yeah, those are my last 2 cents.
Dr. Steph, I want to thank you for coming on the show and giving us such great information. I know I definitely have, and my audience has learned so much. So I really appreciate you coming, taking your time and coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
It was my pleasure. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Steph for coming on and talking to us about a very, very important issue. I'm going to get to the issue in a minute, but more importantly, I want to promote her book and her work. You know where it is, folks. It's down in the details section of our descriptions for the audio and the video podcast. You can also go on our webpage where she has a guest profile. You can click on her work. Go buy the book. I'm going to go buy the book and read the book. Dr. Steph opened my eyes to stuff, and I think that I'm more well versed than the average American when it comes to immigration and migration issues in this country. I think I'm more well versed than the average American. But I learned a lot through this conversation, and I know I'm going to learn a lot more by reading the book. It's probably going to break my heart learning about the stories of what children, let me repeat that, ladies and gentlemen, what children are going through. We talk a great deal in this country about how much we want to protect and care for the children. Time for us to really start backing up what we say is important to us, because this is a very, very important issue. Um, I don't know what to say. I think that was an amazing conversation with Dr. Steph. She's got a fan and a follower in me. I know that since you guys listen and watch, that she has more fans and more followers, because you could tell by the conversation how well versed, and this is the key, a lot of people out here talking about immigration and migration that don't have the knowledge and expertise to be given the opinions that they have. She does. So you could tell by the conversation how well versed she is on the subject and how passionate she is on the subject. That resonates through the interview. And I know when I read the book, it's going to resonate through the words. So go buy the book, go follow her work. I want to implore people, as I always do, empathy, empathy, empathy. You know, Dave Chappelle, and everybody knows how I feel about Dave Chappelle. I am such a fan of him, and there are times where he disappoints me. But he said something that was poignant in one of his conversations that I saw on social media. Actually, it was in one of his stand-ups, and he said, "Everything is funny until it happens to you." Too often, because people aren't affected by something or something doesn't happen to them, they lack the ability to even try and understand. And guess what? You will never understand what another person is going through, because even if you go through the same exact thing, people handle reactions to the same thing differently, because we're not all the same person, right? We have different emotions, different reactions to even to the same instance. So to try to say that you have understanding, you can try to, but you won't have true understanding. What we can always have is empathy. What we can always have is the empathy for the fact that these children are coming here for a better life. And that is truly what America has always been founded on: opportunity to come here for freedom. Now, we don't always live up to it, but that was the ideal of America. Time for us to really lean into that. Time for us to really back up what we say, and time for us to really show empathy for people who are far less fortunate than we are. We're just coming here for a shot. Everybody deserves a shot. Everybody deserves a chance. Once again, thank you to Dr. Stephanie. Thank everybody for listening. Thank everybody for watching. And until next time, as always, I'll hop. That was a hell of a show. Thank you for rocking with us here on Unsolicited Perspectives with Bruce Anthony. Now, before you go, don't forget to follow, subscribe, like, comment, and share our podcast wherever you're listening or watching it to it. Pass it along to your friends. If you enjoy it, that means the people that you rock will enjoy it also. So share the wealth, share the knowledge, share the noise. And for all those people that say, well, I don't have a YouTube. If you have a Gmail account, you have a YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can actually watch our video podcast. But the real party is on our Patreon page, After Hours Uncensored and Talking Straight-ish. After Hours Uncensored is another show with my sister. And once again, the key word there is uncensored. Those are exclusively on our Patreon page. Jump onto our website at unsolicitedperspectives.com for all things us. That's where you can get all of our audio, video, our blogs, and even buy our merch. And if you're really feeling generous and want to help us out, you can donate on our donations page. Donations go strictly to improving our software and hardware so we can keep giving you guys good content that you can clearly listen to and that you can clearly see. So any donation would be appreciative. Most importantly, I want to say thank you for listening and watching and supporting us. And I'll catch you next time. Audi 5000. Peace.